My function here, I think, is to fight the cause of the users of buildings. And I hope you'll get the message as I go through the presentation. I'm a branding guy, and so as a branding guy, I have to make sure that anything or any company or any activity that I work with has an added value and is the first choice for its target consumers. And the users of buildings, I would suggest, are pretty priority target users. So people who know us in Russia, we've been working here for a number of years and have an extensive range of projects with banks and retail, but we're also increasingly working in the office sector and residential sector. I want to talk about sustainability. I'm fascinated by the subject. The more you know, the less you know, I've decided, in sustainability. It's a complex issue. I'm certainly going to pick up on Alexei's comments on the World Green Building Council's report. I was privileged to present it recently. But I do want to pick up some points about the fact that one of the key stakeholders the report doesn't really get into, and Alexei did touch on this, is the user. So I want to talk a bit more about that, and I'll give you maybe a couple of examples. And these examples actually are, I would call, existing buildings. Everyone talks about green building, but they always talk about new building. But there's a hell of a lot of existing buildings, and one of our functions particularly is to look at how do you tackle existing developments or pre-designed developments. Sustainability. I read that in Wikipedia that it has 3 pillars: social, environmental, and economic. And each of those are big subjects. And the World Green Building Council report, certainly got the message over that green building makes good business sense, and it does. And Alexei's touched on a lot of the issues that it's communicating to developers, etc. And it goes through, as Alexei's just told you, all these key elements. But the bit that I'm particularly interested in is the workplace productivity and health. What a dreadful term, workplace productivity and health. You're talking about people. I talk about how do you make places that people really want to work in and enjoy working in. And this conference has been going on about the incredible changes in workplace design or whatever. Frankly, I haven't seen it in Russia. I work with a lot of Russian companies. I walk into their offices and my heart sinks because they're just like hospitals sometimes, and it's pretty depressing. So we've got a lot of work to do in Russia to actually get the message over that an office is not a machine for working in and productivity. It's about where people want to be. So that's going to be my main message of this talk. Alexei showed you this diagram. And I have got a big problem with this diagram. It's got the one most important stakeholder missing, which is the user. And the user actually determines all the other stakeholders' interests. If I'm a retailer, if the shoppers don't come to me, I'm dead. So I'm totally user-centric. And that should be the same for a developer, and it is the same for a developer, because if nobody wants to rent your buildings or buy your buildings, you've got a problem. But it always comes back to the user. If the tenant company cannot persuade its staff to stay and want to be there, it's got a problem. So my basic plea is, can we just open up this diagram and just study who the user is and what they need? I'm an architect, and I'm proud of that. And one of the things that I'm really keen about architecture is the fact that we obviously have to meet what the Roman architect Vitruvius talked about, the 3 qualities of good architecture. This firmness, commodity, and delight. And firmness and commodity are actually fairly measurable things. Is the building functional? Is it doing what it should do? Is it the right kind of building for what it's doing, its strength and stability, etc.? But the bit that intrigues me is, does it then delight its audiences, its users? And sometimes there are sad examples of green buildings that don't do that. They look horrible and they're not particularly great to work in. And we can argue about that, but I've seen quite a few examples. So it's an issue, I think. So let's look at some of these issues in more detail. The environmental issues, the economic issues, and what I'm going to stress, the social issues. You've got experts here to talk about all these wonderful certifications, and my apologies to the German and Austrian people as well, because I know there's a number of measurable certifications out there. And they quite rightly cover all these very important metrics for green building. But my point about happiness and well-being, I think as Alexei touched on, is not really grappled by the certification industry yet. And that's a big problem for me, because basically, as I said at the beginning, how can a building be sustainable if people don't want to go to it, see it, be in it? Developers, they have to be acutely aware of what the market is demanding, because they're there to sell and rent their buildings. So they've got to really understand the changing market dynamics, and they are changing. I work in London, and London's got some major issues which I'll talk about in terms of the latest trends in offices. So they have to be very clear as a developer, how do they design new buildings, how do they convert old buildings, how do they refurbish them, and make them future-proof and fit for purpose. Because if they're not, and if they're not consumer-centric, they won't make any money. It's very simple. So the social, this is the interesting aspect I want to study with you. You've got new occupiers with new values, and people have talked about that. Yesterday I listened to presentations, and everyone's talking about collaboration and interaction and all those wonderful things. And certainly, you know, things have changed dramatically since the 50s and 60s when you had these white-collar factories as such, and now everyone wants to be a creative hub. But basically, you've got a completely changing workforce now. And the war for talent, as Alexei mentioned, has got major economic consequences, which can be measured. You can measure the cost of staff churn. You can measure the cost of recruitment and retraining. My Russian database is a nightmare because people stay in their jobs for so short a time. This is crazy. There's something wrong with a society where people only stay and work for a year and then move on. So there's some issues there that need to be addressed by employers if they want to make any money. And also, look how things have changed. London's very interesting because the banking sector, as we all know, has been under pressure. And that was the driving force in London. You know, the big city offices, prestige offices, the banks wanted, fantastic. Not now. The big sector that's really moving now is the TMT sector, the technology, media, and telecom sector. And those people want a completely different set of criteria for their office and workplaces. They want funky locations. ArtPlay here is a very good example of what is happening in London. East London is now the new London. You know, if you want to be trendy and cool or whatever, you grab an office there. But they're not new offices. They're old factories, they're old manufacturing plants like this. And that's where green certification's really got to get its act together to really relate to that. These guys want real value. They're not going to pay a high rent. They want to be able to have very flexible contracts so they can get out in 2 years. They want to do a quick conversion of a building that can maybe only have a 2-year life. That's reality, but it's also sustainable because they're actually using old developments that need to be used. You know, the English government is always talking about brownfield site development because they have to. We haven't got any greenfield. And so that whole angle of measuring how do you work with existing pretty often poor buildings in terms of their fabric and structure but make them sustainable, there's a challenge. So those different specifications are now driving developers in quite different directions. Always makes me laugh. I always show the cyclist, and in London, the big feature of London is everyone's cycling now. I was asked by a journalist yesterday, when's that going to happen in Moscow? And I suggested you're quite a few years off because you still love your cars. It will come, but it's a measure for me of how sustainable a society is that you don't sit in your car for 3 hours a day. So as I said, the offices should very much, and workplaces should very much be consumer-driven, not investor-driven. That's a basic fact of life. And obviously all the good things that are talked about here at this conference in terms of connectivity and diversity and creating really fun places, but also very efficient places, all that's a given, and you have to do it. And if a lot of companies I work with could get to that stage, it would be good news. But certainly that flexibility is necessary. And obviously, as a branding guy, a company's image is very much driven by its workplaces. You judge a company about how they are and how their people are. And, you know, just simple examples, whether you're a virgin and cool and relaxed, taking old buildings and fitting them out temporarily, or whether you're a more sophisticated design-orientated group or marketing group or whatever, everyone has a certain character that has to be defined. And here's a classic extreme example. We've come a long way since the Battery Hen offices of the 60s and 50s. Everyone shows these lovely pictures of pods and all the rest of it. I still have to see them in Russia, but I'm sure they're there somewhere. But obviously the function of all workplaces is to inspire and motivate and facilitate what the employees want. I'm just going to finish very quickly with a couple of case studies. And again, these are, I call existing building refits, if you like. HSBC is an immense project in that they have 7,000 offices, 760 offices worldwide in 81 countries. And they basically wanted us to try and figure out how they can have a very sustainable approach to converting their workplaces to express their new values and also relate it to local culture, so it's not just one size fits all. And they had these values and attributes that they wanted to communicate through their workplaces. So we did a highly graphic-orientated approach, which is very sustainable because it's cost-effective and very flexible, but also very effective because it's actually able to completely convert sterile offices into quite fun and interesting places, purely by the use of decor, purely by the use of very carefully organized and designed elements, as you see here. And then lastly, I want to talk about a Moscow development. This was a new building, but for me it was like an existing building, and it was pretty horrible, I think. I hope the architect's not here. But I thought it was a not particularly conducive building for offices. And so our job here was to come up with a brand for the offices where, and it says here, where people and technology come together. You know, the whole idea was a strong positioning for a new business complex. And so we looked at the brand, we looked at the imagery that could go with that to demonstrate connectivity, etc. And we developed, as you see here, the imagery and signatures and the decor that would actually reflect those values and those attributes. And I'll flick through these very quickly. But it's an example of taking what I would call a fairly sterile building without any personality at all and completely transforming it into a distinctive destination where people hopefully want to be. And I'll just finish with this slide, really, which is about winning hearts and minds. If you want real sustainability, i.e. buildings that people want to be in, it's got to actually have, if you like, the best attributes of branding and creating places where people want to be. So I'm sure we can take questions later. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Спасибо большое. Я хотел бы в качестве такого как бы дискуссионного момента Николауса Хелицгрубера попросить прокомментировать это выступление коротко, буквально в течение пары минут, относительно того, действительно ли все зеленые стандарты настолько безжалостны к пользователю, или все-таки есть стандарты, которые предусматривают такой обширный социальный аспект и пользовательское удовлетворение.
Могу по-английски, потому что лучше по-английски. начинаю по-русски, если не хватает, по-английски, пожалуйста. Что Клайв сказал, есть такой, ну, как стандарт из Германии, называется DGMB, и в Австрии это есть вариант ÖGNI называется. И там они тоже дополнительно посмотрят на социокультуральные факторы, значит, человек, ну, как важно, и стоят на середине. И дополнительно они тоже посмотрят на life cycle на полное здание. Сейчас покажу. Здесь, ну, здесь чуть-чуть старая таблица, но там написано, какие разницы из премий лиц есть. Ну, видите, это социальные аспекты, они посмотреть побольше уже. Значит, все, что Клайв сейчас сказал, уже включено в этом системе. Ну, это сейчас развивается, и они тоже хотят, что это не просто все экологические, ну, как пункты в середине, но тоже человек должен чувствовать себя хорошо в этом здании. И здоровье должен быть тоже. Это... И тоже для инвестора они посмотрят на вот это life cycle cost, значит, они посмотрят, какие оборудования возьмут, какие фасад, что они действуют долгосрочно, значит, до 50 лет. И когда надо изменяться, ну, как какие-то оборудования или, ну, как часть из здания, что это можно делать, ну, как дешевле, чем, ну, как сказать, тем других, и легко.